everybody. My name is Alfie Potter, and my pronouns are he, him. So I work in the technology space. I am a technical analyst for ITV. My role sits within our enterprise architecture team. I work with AI technologies, but also software as a whole across a business. I also volunteer my time with an organization called Out and Tech, which is bringing queer and LGBTQ plus events to people in London who work in the tech industry. Thank you very much.
Okay, and Harry.
Hi, I'm Harry Muncy. Thanks for having me. My pronouns are they, them. I am Senior Director for Responsible AI and Data Science at Elsevier. For those of you who don't know, it's an academic publisher, information analytics business, and so we do solutions for researchers and healthcare professionals. AI is one of the technologies that we leverage, so it's really crucial that we do so in a thoughtful and responsible way, given the potential for negative impacts, including the types of harms we're talking about today. I'm queer and non-binary, so interested in how our community is impacted by AI, as well as how I can represent queer viewpoints in the work that I do at Elsevier.
Thanks, Harry. And Dawn.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here and for Harriet for pulling this together. My name is Dawn McCara-Hunter. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Programme Manager at the Scottish AI Alliance. So the Scottish AI Alliance is the body tasked with the delivery of Scotland's national AI strategy, which is a focus on kind of making Scotland a leader in trustworthy, ethical and inclusive AI. So I lead predominantly around our AI literacy and business support functions. And one of the main sort of kind of things that we look to embody is like inclusion across like all different communities and an understanding of the impact of not being inclusive in your sort of like AI adoption and development kind of journey. When I'm not doing that, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of the West of Scotland, where I look at the impact of AI on the LGBTQ community from a sort of kind of structural power perspective. So I'm kind of really interested in the kind of way that AI can shape the kind of way that we are like represented, but also the way that we might be able to engage with kind of emerging technology in order to sort of kind of have a sort of better representation and sort of advocacy for the community. So that is me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dawn. And Eleanor.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Drage. Thanks very much for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to this. I am a senior researcher at an AI ethics unit at the University of Cambridge called the Centre for the Future of Intelligence. And I specialise in feminist, queer and anti-racist perspectives on AI.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'm delighted to have you all here. And I think that leads us to our first topic of the session, which is generative AI. For those less familiar, can you briefly explain how generative AI works, particularly in the context of natural language processing and image generation? And I'm going to direct that at you, Alfie.
Hi, yes, absolutely. So generative AI works by analyzing vast amount of data to recognize patterns, and then it uses those patterns to generate new content. It's kind of on the basis of it all. Now, in reference to, let's say, natural language processing, models like ChatGPT are trained on diverse data sets. Well, that's what we're discussing today. How diverse are they? But a range of text data sets, allowing them to generate human-like responses by predicting the most likely next word based on the context. So I think a big thing to keep in mind is these models don't think for themselves. We've not got there yet. It's all about statistical probabilities about what the next word would be for the prompt that is given. And then same with image generation. That one's actually a little bit more fascinating, I think quite cool when you think about it. So it takes images as its data set and it breaks them down into its components. So those components are like the colors, the shapes, the textures and the compositions. And it does the same thing as text, except it treats images like text. So it brings all these different components together and someone does a prompt like purple cat wearing sunglasses. And rather than taking an image of that already exists, because it probably won't, but rather than doing that, it takes what it's learned and figures out the pattern. So it thinks, okay, what have I learned about what a cat typically looks like? What have I learned about what purple looks like on fur? And how do sunglasses sit on a face? So it takes all of those ideas that it's been able to pick up and follows those patterns to then generate the image that you would see on the screen, which is why I think that part of generative blows my mind personally. So kind of to contextualize that in that kind of as an example, if you think about a chef, and they learn to cook by reading thousands of different recipes, and they might not know the recipe you're asking it to create, but they will understand how ingredients or how words are commonly combined to create dishes. And when asked to make a new dish, it will think about the patterns of like, oh, well, this ingredient and this ingredient worked well together, so I'm going to predict that most likely is what I'm going to need to respond. So in that kind of context for text, and then you can think the same way as well with images. And when it comes to an artist, they can study thousands of paintings and they think about what elements of those paintings go well together. So when they're requested to make something, they think about those patterns that they previously had learnt and they go and make. And I think that's an important distinction on the point of the thinking, and that's what we're going to get into a bit later, is that these models don't think, they learn from something they are provided, and from those learnings they then create the output that we prompt for. So it's all about what goes into them, it impacts the output. So that's kind of an overview of generative AI. If there's any more questions, I'm sure we can answer them later on, but I hope that helps.
Really great imagery there, Alfie. And that kind of leads us on to our next point, which is, what role does training data play in shaping how AI represents different communities, including queer individuals? And I think I'll start with Harry.
Thanks, Harriet. That's a great question and leads on really nicely from what Alfie was saying about how an AI learns about its context. So that is happening through the training data, which is absolutely critical. So the training data kind of is how the system learns about the world, its contexts, how to fulfill the tasks that it's designed to do. So if your training data is lacking representation of particular communities or identities, then the AI is going to lack awareness or understanding of those communities. And in the case of generative AI, how to create content representative of them. Similarly, if training data reflects biases, stereotypes, inaccuracies about communities, then its output is going to carry those through. And this kind of lack of diversity can manifest in several kind of undesirable outcomes. So the AI might reinforce negative stereotypes or fail to represent the diversity within the queer community. It might mean that AI is unable to deal with the topics of queer identities, issues, or histories kind of sensitively or accurately. And that in itself can also result in then queer content imagery being filtered perhaps as inappropriate by AI safety features, often by design to kind of avoid controversial output. So as Alfie mentioned, those associations between kind of words, concepts, ideas, different types of images are learnt from that training data. So if we don't have, so the training data is going to inform the model about the kinds of associations that we have with language and imagery that describes the queer community.
And you mentioned negative stereotypes there, Harry. What are some of the most prevalent biases in generative AI when it comes to queer representation? Are there specific examples where AI-generated content has either kind of misrepresented or erased queer identities? And I'm happy for absolutely anyone to jump in on this.
Yeah, so it's tricky because queerness can often be kind of maybe a less observable characteristic. So it's challenging to sort of quantify that representation or misrepresentation. A lot of the research around gender bias in AI-generated content is quite gender binary centric. But I mean, there's a lot of examples demonstrating problematic stereotypes around binary gender roles as a starting point. And then those issues don't kind of get better when we look at queer identities. Non-cisgender identities consistently misrepresented as maybe less human, more stereotyped and sexualized. And we see the types of like outdated LGBTQ plus stereotypes that were common maybe in mainstream media some years ago. So sort of, you know, like gay men depicted as fashionable with killer abs, and lesbians with tattoos and nose rings, hypersexualized images of trans women, a tendency to default to binary genders, and some articles I found sort of maybe more anecdotally, general abundance of purple hair, for example. There's also the kind of whitewashing and lack of intersectionality, which are important issues. In text, so we're seeing problems around misgendering. Gender neutral pronouns can even be associated with sort of worse performance of the AI model. And like this is all pretty disappointing, but it's not necessarily surprising given what we've talked about with the training data. Queerness is usually also kind of associated with challenging traditional societal ideas, maybe norms of gender and sexuality. So if those kind of dominant identities are the default for informing how our AI systems learn about spectrums and concepts of gender and sexuality, then those AI systems are really going to struggle to represent queerness in an accurate way.
And I saw you kind of nodding along there, Dawn. Would you like to add and jump in?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just as Harry had said, like there's the abundance of purple hair was covered in a Wired article from last year, and it really does kind of evoke a particular type of queer person from maybe like 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. Really one of the things that we tend to see is that unless there is like specific instruction to include a broader range of characteristics, be that ethnicity, be that nationality, be that disability, for example, then there does tend to be in image generation a sort of like default, like reverting to white, to cis, to able-bodied, without taking in like the kind of full spectrum of queer identities and queer representation. And I think as well, one of the things that we can see as a compounding factor when it comes to like stereotyping and kind of generative AI outputs is when we kind of combine it with like those intersectional identities as well. So, for example, utilizing kind of Gen AI stuff to try and like create representative and diverse images without using a representative or diverse team to be able to do that is just going to really kind of like create this feedback loop of kind of a really homogenous kind of representation of the culture. And I think it's also quite important as well to point out that like while a lot of these kind of stereotypes or depictions might seem relatively harmless, I say as a white, able-bodied, cisgendered woman, they actually like feed into bigger narratives around infantilization of the queer community, othering of the queer community, racial or kind of gender homogeneity of the queer community, or hyper or desexualization as well, which are all ultimately quite harmful, overarching kind of narratives that we kind of struggle with on a regular basis. So we can have a little giggle about, yeah, it's purple hair, and I had purple hair before. I know, like, you mean there's a little modicum of truth in there, but it actually kind of like it feeds into like bigger, more structural challenges for the queer community.
That's some really, really interesting points. And I see, Eleanor, I would love to get your perspective on this as well. I can see that you're kind of nodding.
Oh, it made me think of there was a horrible experiment a couple of years ago by Wang and Koskinsky, these two guys at Stanford, and they were trying to create sexuality recognition technology, and they thought that sexuality was something that could be brought out, sort of enfleshed in a person, and there was a kind of biological essence to everybody's sexuality, and AI could read that off a screen. And what it was actually doing was associating things like purple hair, makeup, the way people express themselves with their stated sexuality. And at the time, I was on a couple of different dating apps, and I had different sexualities on different dating apps, depending on who I wanted to meet in a particular region. I live between two cities. And I thought how interesting it is that there's this assumption, and there's so many assumptions that are made to say that you can read somebody off a screen by looking at their face, and it taps into this born this way narrative that has been really helpful for the LGBT community. It's been, a way of justifying what it means to be born queer, but that has been misinterpreted. And the problem is at this point is that if you have people building these technologies that don't actually know anything about the people that they're trying to create a technology for, if you take them at face value, this sort of disqualifies all attempts to build a good technology in the first place. So I know my next question is supposed to be, does and can AI amplify diverse voices? And really the fundamental answer to that is, nothing about us without us. We should not have technologies that are trying to do anything in the realm of sexuality and queerness that don't have the people that the technologies are being built for as the core part of that production process, because they're just going to be really awful and useless. Anyway, I can say more about that, but that was kind of what I was thinking when you're talking about purple hair.
Thanks, Eleanor. And it kind of leads me to, how do algorithmic biases in AI impact real-world experiences, such as content visibility on social media or online safety? Dawn, would you like to?
Yeah, so I think that I think we've already sort of touched on, or Harry's already kind of touched on some of the kind of like issues that we can have around like content moderation or content recommendations and things like that by flagging queer content as inappropriate or prioritizing heteronormative narratives. And we see this like intersectionally across all sorts of different creators who don't fit that norm. For example, we see it with particularly around like fat phobia and queer phobia being combined around like queer fat creators on TikTok, for example. And this is sort of like a real kind of way of suppressing kind of narratives, suppressing information, and suppressing community around kind of queer connection, queer content, and like yeah, and kind of potentially has like a real issue around like kind of impacting the way that queer people are able to sort of like connect with each other and kind of interact like across social media platforms and kind of like online content platforms. But I think it's important to think from a sort of kind of safety perspective or like a kind of more overarching perspective that algorithmic bias kind of extends like beyond kind of the world of content moderation and recommendation, even though some of the kind of safety implications of that can be quite quite direct. For example, the groomer narrative is something which is connected, unfortunately, quite closely to the queer community by kind of very insidious groups, and the proliferation of queer as groomer or trans or non-binary as groomer or gay as groomer. We've seen like a real kind of like rapid uptake of the way that sort of narrative proliferates across social media platforms because of the use of content recommendation systems, particularly in the likes of kind of TikTok, for example, where it is shown that it is very easy to go down a very particular type of like reactionary rabbit hole based on a few incorrect likes or clicks, and that really intensifies like these online narratives about queer people, which can then be seen in offline actions against our community. But I think that we see the impact of algorithmic bias across a massive spectrum of different situations with impacts on the queer community. So we see it in healthcare, where incomplete healthcare data can lead to poorer outcomes for queer people. We can see it at border control, where the intersectionality of queerness and ethnicity, or queerness and like a non-dominant language, for example, can see LGBTQ people being flagged as being deceitful at the border when they're seeking asylum or looking to cross into the border, which has massive impacts for people, real world impacts. And I think we can also see it in the way that we engage with queerness on a social and cultural level. Like as Eleanor pointed out, the fascination with AI gaydar, I think that was probably one of the first things that came out about how you could use AI generation to kind of like make a really big splash about what was possible. And I always found it really funny that the Stanford researchers later went back and said, no, we did it to show how bad these things can be, after everybody was very, very angry about suggesting that you can tell people are gay from an AI algorithm. But also that these ideas don't exist like just in a sort of like technological vacuum. Like we've also seen the development of these kind of like ideas about queer otherness, or these ideas about the inherent biological inevitability of being able to tell who a queer person is through the use of like AI to quote unquote identify trans and non-binary people to prevent them from accessing certain social media sites, Giggle for Girls being the one that you've probably heard about. So the inherent queer phobia that we see in our society is sort of embedded in like the ongoing development of technology, and there are more ways in which the technology can be applied to kind of making online and offline spaces unsafe for queer people or inaccessible to queer people. And I think that's kind of something that is only becoming more like prevalent as we sort of look at developing AI systems which are embedded across a variety of different like large scale public sector organizations, welfare benefits, decision-making decisions, and things like that. So I think it's like a real key kind of concern and a massive impact for the community.
Fantastic points there, Dawn. A lot of food for thought. And we kind of touched on training data and lack of data diversity earlier. And looking at future directions, what practical steps can be taken to make AI generated content more inclusive and representative of queer identities? And Alfie, I'm going to go with you there.
Hello. Yes, it's interesting because we all have different expertise here in different areas, but someone with current industry at the moment, I think, as always, it's about getting the representation in the room, working on the technology is the first of the easier steps, is making sure that the people are involved in the discussion, in the creation of these products and of these models. And I think that's always been the problem with diversity, with trying to get diversity in anything within the technology industry. So something that I do within like our volunteer groups is trying to bring people together and creating those networks so that those conversations can be had about, how did you even get into the realm of AI? Because the thing with AI, there's so many complexities to it. There's so many different elements that actually there is quite a barrier to entry because people don't know where to start. And if then the people don't know where to start, then they're not going to get involved. So I think in corporate organizations, they have a responsibility to ensure they're offering training and development for people that want to get into that space. And then once they're in that space, then they can be the ones to shape the guidelines and be there to ask the correct questions about this about any discrepancies in training data and such. So I guess maybe not the most revolutionary suggestion, but it is getting people in the room and helping those who, if you are in the position where you are making an impact, bringing others with you is definitely a big part. And that kind of goes for anything within at least the technology space, I can say.
Yeah. And I'd ask as well, what role should policymakers and tech companies play in addressing AI bias against marginalized communities? And Harry, I'll go with you with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think policymakers have a really important role to play in incentivizing tech companies to kind of do better in leveling up their approach to AI bias. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of legislation introduced, maybe more around sort of non-discrimination for like automated or algorithmic decision making. There's been legislation tackling sort of bias in modeling for things like credit scoring and sort of financial service allocation for a while. But these measures are typically sort of focused more around those sort of allocative or allocation harms. So whether or not somebody gets access to a service or opportunity, and maybe less about the types of representational harms that we're talking about that are a bigger negative consequence for AI. And I think there's definitely more that tech companies can be doing in this space. Like better understanding the limitations of the training data, how can we increase the diversity of data sources? How can we support, encourage tech companies to make more of an effort to sort of practice that like participatory design process around the algorithms, increasing diversity in the development teams, as Alfie mentioned. And kind of sort of looking at the possible technical solutions. How do we embed ethical policies into training and AI training and optimization, especially where we know training data's got blind spots or limitations? How do we develop AI that might better deal with kind of context or data that it hasn't encountered before, deal with topics that it knows little about in a sensitive manner, without resorting to kind of censorship through content filters? I mean, this isn't a problem that's going to go away, and it's also one that's not going to it's not just impacting the queer community. Like the way our language, our imagery, our societal values that we're trying to embed in these algorithms change and drift over time. And so maybe we need to shift our expectations from thinking that we can have a kind of general purpose generative AI model that can accomplish every type of task for us, to understanding kind of what type of AI train on what type of data and what type of behavior is most appropriate for a given context.
Fantastic points there, Harry. And Eleanor, I'd really like to get your perspective on this as well.
Well, there's been some really great points that have been made. I think what I would add to this is that we could even dig, deeper to the fundamentals. I was with an amazing philosopher called Wendy Chun last week at a great conference on the humanities and AI, and trying to bring the humanities to bear in AI. For me, that's about bringing queer theory into the way that we create AI in the first place. And Wendy was saying that reinforcement learning, which is all about the carrot and the stick, saying, to the system, you got this wrong, this is what you should do instead, reward and punishment. How can we actually introduce some less sadistic ways of making an AI system learn? So how can we, for example, bring the education faculty that I collaborate with a lot, who take pedagogy really seriously, and say, what is learning to you? And actually, how can we teach AI to learn in different kinds of ways? So you can use really interesting philosophies and theories to actually build new kinds of systems. And I'm really encouraged by the collaborations that we saw last week that are trying to do that. I have this podcast called The Good Robot, and we've interviewed a lot of queer theorists who have been talking about not just making AI better at recognizing queer bodies, but making bodies better at evading recognition. How can we introduce ambiguity and doubt into these systems? How can we respect the body's right not to be fully knowable and to change? And when Kerry and I spoke to Jack Halberstam quite a few years ago about this, I was thinking about this amazing book I just read by Omasek and Natasha Tinsley called Azili's Mirrors. And in it, sexuality is extremely evasive and speaks through different voices. And these are really sort of beautiful and important ways of thinking about what it means for an AI system to interact with a body. So when Halberstam had that situation in the airport, where he was asked to go through the TSA terminal, and they pressed the blue or the pink button, depending on whether they thought the body was a blue body or a pink body. And why are we being asked these questions of our gender anyway and our sexuality? These are just disciplinary mechanisms. So I think we need to fundamentally contest the way that gender is being used in these systems in the first place, but also use queer ideas to foreground the ambiguity and doubt that's really there at the core of what it means to be a human navigating through life.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was like quite amazing. And I'd finally like to ask, how can everyone push for more equitable AI systems, and not just the queer community? And Dawn, I'm going to ask you that question.
Thanks, Harriet. I think coming from a government AI strategy perspective, I think that at the policy level, at the governmental level, there really needs to be more sort of active participation, and invited participation from the queer community around policy discussions and policy development around AI. And I think that goes not just for the queer community, right? I think that goes for any marginalized community or community likely to be impacted by the design, development or deployment of an AI system that en masse or at much risk. And I think it's really, really important to have policymakers who are committed to that active participation and collaborative participatory involvement from marginalised communities in developing policies and frameworks around AI use and regulation and implementation, particularly in the public sector. I think that what we are seeing a lot of just now is a focus on AI solutionism in the sort of policy space and in the governmental space, and techno solutionism, and taking a sort of technology first approach to AI implementation rather than a sort of a kind of problem first approach to AI implementation. And I feel like having more kind of direct sort of involvement from various communities and community advocates in that policy space, but having the policymakers who are aware in the first place to even be able to know to have those conversations, I think is really, really important. And just kind of starting from that kind of policy advocacy level, I think is important in a way for allies and kind of policymakers of all stripes to get involved in the conversation around making more equitable and fair and ethical AI development and deployment more possible.
Thanks, Dawn. That's some really important and very insightful points there. I think this does kind of lead us on to, in the essence of time, the Q&A, and we have received a Q&A. So I'd like to ask you, is this an issue that creators of LLMs are aware of but unwilling to act upon, or does a degree of education and awareness raising come first? And who would like to tackle that question?
Can I start off, maybe not with an answer, but with a little bit of an anecdote? So I actually attended, at the start of my PhD, I think I attended an event that Eleanor was speaking at, and I had a really cynical, negative view of AI developers, and that there was a real sort of there was a real sort of lack of care or maybe ulterior motive about why you would have AI that had such biases encoded in it and all that sort of thing. And I think I remember Eleanor saying actually people want to do a good job. It's it really is an awareness thing. Now, maybe we've moved on beyond that conversation in the last couple of years, since the sort of kind of LLM boom of the last couple of years. But I've found in my kind of like interaction and engagement with businesses and enterprises is that the desire to do a good job and the desire to do it right is there. What tends to be lacking is the engagement with the communities who are most likely to be harmed by or impacted by the implementation of these technologies, and also like a greater understanding of the sort of the risks and impacts inherent in any sort of technological implementation. So that's kind of like a little bit of an evolution of my thinking. I tend to try and be quite optimistic about these things, but I'm sure there's other opinions in the room.
Yeah, and I maybe just thanks for coming to whatever that was. I appreciate it. I met a guy at a gay night a couple of weeks ago who was an engineer at Google, and he was like the classic like, oh, I'm sorry, you know, and I'm like, oh, do it. He's like, I just feel like it's better that I'm there, that I'm not there, but it's like hard to know. So I mean, that there are many different kinds of engineers, and actually there's now lots of papers that document engineers' experiences making stuff they don't agree with. And there's a paper I can share that was a study of Portuguese AI engineers, and it showed that when they make things that they disagree with on a kind of political level, it really affects their mental health. And there were some engineers who were purposefully doing a bad job or not coming into work or on sick leave because the systems that they were building, they fundamentally disagree. So I think we really need to pay attention to this as signs that the kinds of things that are being built are not appropriate, and there are warning signs of this. But also, engineers are people, and it's just that they don't receive enough training, and we need to fundamentally change the way computer science degrees are taught. But it's so difficult because they, it's like changing the syllabus of a course. It involves lots of different stakeholders and convincing people that ethics is not just 1 week or 1 day. It should be integrated in every aspect of learning and teaching. You know, saying reinforcement learning doesn't have to be done like this. You know, that is, oh my gosh, you'd be lined up and shot at Cambridge in the computers faculty if you had, you came in and said that. So it's what we're trying to do, but it's very slow and painful, pulling hairs, trying to get the course to change.
Thanks, Eleanor. And building off that, we have just had another question come through, which is, what role do you see educational institutions playing in educating people on AI bias? Have you seen any good practice? Is she frozen? I think she might be frozen. So. Would anybody else like to answer that question?
I'll just pop in and say that, like, from a sort of kind of policy perspective, or a kind of like a kind of ongoing sort of like public sector perspective, like AI in education, either the use of AI directly in education or educating about people about AI, seems to be something which is quite fraught, like in the education space at the moment, in terms of like, how do we do it? How do we do it ethically? How do we make sure that we're still like retaining the integrity of and credibility of assessment and that sort of thing? But from what I've seen, and I'm based in the University of Edinburgh, is like there is a really, really big push to educate staff, students, stakeholders, suppliers around that ethical use of AI, and around having a really good grounded understanding of what it means to engage with AI in a sort of kind of ethical way. And one of the things that I do at the Scottish AI Alliance is I lead on our public AI literacy programme, which is called Living with AI. We plug there, and it's about It's about taking AI literacy as a very, very basic foundation, and making sure that ethics is sort of like really, really embedded in that. It's not about having a technical foundation in AI, it's about having an ethical, social, and cultural understanding of the impact of AI, from which you can go ahead and start building more skills, whether that be in like the critique and understanding of AI and its impacts, or whether that be like technically. And I think having a real drive and an impetus to really focus on AI literacy and embed AI literacy along with digital literacy, data literacy, media literacy, I think is really, really important to actually meaningfully start having conversations around education. Because I've been thinking recently, we don't expect people to start secondary school or college or work without being able to read, but we're expecting people to jump into the world of data and AI without having a basic level of data, digital and AI literacy. So I think it's really, really important that we kind of get that right, and kind of support a foundational sort of like baseline understanding of literacy, not just in AI literacy, but like I said, I think media literacy is really important and connected to AI literacy, and also that digital and data literacy as well.
Thank you, Dawn. And we do actually have one final question, which is how do we navigate the different regulations, such as UK and EU on AI and how it relates to bias? And Harry, I wonder if you could answer that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure quite what the asker is getting at. So in terms of sort of users of AI, or as an AI developer, how we deal with the kind of fragmented global landscape. I mean, just kind of for a bit of context, there are different regulators in different jurisdictions taking different approaches to AI regulation. Some are sort of like hanging back, waiting to see. There's other ones. So, for example, the EU is sort of leading the way with really comprehensive regulation in the form of the EU AI Act, and then in the UK, a different approach again, and also so as a global organization, part of my role at Elsevier is understanding how these different landscapes implement the way in which we develop AI. But most of the legislation is designed to kind of uphold sort of common principles. So these principles of bias, fairness, transparency, accountability, oversight, with kind of differences in terms of the sort of nuts and bolts of the implementation. We're sort of at a point now where so the EU AI Act, for example, is in effect, but we're still figuring out sort of what that looks like from an implementation perspective, and there's still work underway to develop those kind of standards for how bias mitigation looks from a compliance perspective. So I think this is a space that's very much in flux, and it's methodology, standards, protocols, and things that are still kind of an open discussion as to how those should be implemented in practice and how the different regulatory bodies enforce that as well.
And can I just quickly jump in? Yeah, I'm totally there with Harry. I have just built this tool called Heat with an AI company, and it's a pro-justice approach to implementing the EU AI Act in AI companies. And what we've done is we've taken ideas from feminist, anti-racist, and queer and disability theory, and we have brought the EU's principles to life. And this is not just about diversity, it's about the ideation stage at the beginning where you think, hang on, do we need AI for this? Is AI the right job, the right tool for the job? What are we actually trying to achieve here? So it goes all the way from the bottom, all the way through data management, thinking about how to do that in the most pro-justice way possible. And the reason why we did this is because the UK is really taking a backseat. We've been super disappointed with what Starmer has said around making the following after Trump and pandering after the US. Even the action plan really lacks all that language around diversity that the US is just knocking off at the moment. So the EU has been thinking about diversity, inclusion, representation for a really long time. They tend to take a much more stringent approach, and has been really pioneering childcare, paternity leave. Those kinds of things were all EU innovations. So if for companies that actually care, and there are a lot of those companies that come to us all the time at Cambridge and say, right, we or our customers really expect us to do better, how can we do it? So we've created something that says, look, here it is, and it's easy to achieve.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And thank you to our attendees for asking such interesting questions. Just from a time aspect, we are going to move on to our closing remarks. So I will be asking each of the panel, in a sentence or less, what's one thing you would like attendees to take away from this panel? And I think we shall start with you, Alfie.
Yes. I think mine would be, don't assume that there's diversity. Question what data is being used to train the models that you use. There are a lot of companies out there. There are many that are good. There are many that are questionable. I think ask the questions and do your research.
Great, thank you, Alfie. And Harry.
I think follows on from what Alfie's were. So learning about this issue, talking about it, a great start, helping to increase awareness. If you're a regular user of generative AI, bear in mind these sort of limitations when you're using it to create content. Like, what are the stereotypes that might be showing up in what you're creating, and how can you kind of help combat those, either through how you use a particular tool or making maybe a more informed choice, as Alfie said, about like which companies are kind of committed to providing an actually sort of inclusive, equitable AI product.
Yeah, great. Fantastic point, Harry. And Dawn?
Yeah, I think I would just say that there are better possibilities and brighter possibilities for AI use and kind of AI adoption for the queer community and for all marginalized communities. But in order for us to realize that, we need to be involved in the conversation, not just us, but allies as well. Use your privilege, allies. But we need to be in the room. We need to be advocating for our community. We need to be advocating for considered ethical development and use of AI, particularly in our public services. And we need to push for transparency in these processes, push for accountability in these processes, and challenge like biases where we see them, challenge negative or like unfair or or highly impactful uses of AI. Like wherever we see them, we have to be really vocal, we have to be really involved, and we also have to not just leave it up to the queer community as well.
Thank you, Dawn. And Eleanor?
Yeah, I would divide my two things that I want to say into things that to be encouraged by and to say no to. So firstly, say no to the crap that's operating under a veneer of inclusive interventions, like Facebook's adding of the 51 or 52 very arbitrary categories and saying, oh look, we've got all these different gender categories for you, now you are included. And there was that great paper written a while ago by R. Bivens, the gender binary will not be deprogrammed. Understanding what actually is a meaningful intervention and what isn't. And there's an amazing book by Kevin Guyon on queer data, and he's got a new book out as well at the moment. And I just wanted to read a line from that, from an interviewee called Kirsty, who said, queer visibility does help, but it's very long term. For me, it really comes down to who gets to actively say who they are and who gets labels placed upon them. That's the big crux of the issue. So who is doing the categorization and on whose behalf? And then get inspired. There's some amazing work by artists like Jack Elways, who does deepfake drag and querying the data set. So they use drag and mimesis to help us understand AI better. And there's some really funny, interesting double acts between a drag queen and a deepfake AI that really explores issues around representation and diversity and how generative AI can bring those to life and how we can tease out these queer representations that defy kind of boring normative stuff that Gen AI churns out on a daily basis. And there's also an amazing project called Multivocal, and it's not a explicitly queer project, but it was about bringing lots of different voices, heterogeneity of voices into voice assistants. They don't all sound like these really dull gendered Siris and Alexas. And then we haven't mentioned disability very much. So I also wanted to have a shout out to Michelle Wronski's AI assistant. And these kinds of tools that my colleague Kerry and I use really often. And they can be really amazing for helping us write transcripts. These AI assistants that, for example, my colleague uses Dragon AI, and that's really helpful to her. And these tools have such a big potential to help anyone with writing issues or anyone that needs that additional support. But because the funding goes to adding features that are more there to support, for example, dubbing and other sort of more lucrative but less disability focused approaches, that's kind of where the interventions go. So we just need a lot more push around making these tools really supportive, particularly for people with disabilities.
Thank you, Eleanor. And I think that quite nicely brings us to the end of this session. A huge thank you to our panelists for this incredible conversation and their insight. I really hope you've enjoyed this panel as much as I have. There's some really valuable perspectives to take away and think about. You can find out more about upcoming Tech Together events via the link I posted in the chat. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.